You'll see this says Buddhism and Islam, Connections and Tensions in the 8th through 13th century CE, Part 2. This is a continuation of a talk that I gave in February, where I primarily just laid out some of the basic features of Islam that are worth keeping in mind when we talk about Buddhism and Islam. I'm basically going to begin here where the last talk ended, which is with the Kālacakratantra. I don't assume that you've seen that or that you have any knowledge of Islam, and so I am going to go over a couple of basic things. And so hopefully there's not going to be too much repetition for those who already saw my first talk. So for our purposes, we need to know Sunnis, Sufis, Twelver Shias, and Ismailis. So it's pretty straightforward. Sunnis make up presently about 80% of Muslims today. The other 20%, broadly speaking, being Shia, two main groups of Shias, mainly Ash'ari Shias or Twelver Shias. But we're more concerned here with Sevener Shias, also called Ismailis, and the reason for that will be clear in a moment. It is important to note that these are different groups that do have historically had some, animosity toward each other. That also features in our story, and mainly the difference between the groups is the way in which succession after the Prophet takes place, with Sunnis favoring a more what we might call recognizably democratic approach, where Shias hold that there's something kind of biological or genetic in the Prophet's bloodline, such that the leader should be related in some way by blood to the Prophet. And likewise, you need to pay attention to who you're reading. If you read Omid Safi, who's a very prominent Shia scholar in English, he tells things very differently than a Sunni, a Sufi, or an academic might tell things. We're not saying one's right or wrong, just we need to keep these contexts in mind. Okay, so the Kālacakratantra, the Dukikor, right, the Wheel of Time, is probably the latest major tantra to arise in India. I write here 1015. John Newman has argued, I think convincingly, that it's probably more like 1026 or 1030. And it's an encyclopedic text. I'll say more about that later. It is, of course, a tantra, so it does contain a full path to enlightenment, but it contains a description of the world, and particularly for our purposes, it gives what I believe is the only example of apocalyptic literature in Buddhist tantric literature. It tells an apocalyptic story that seems like it was pretty clearly influenced in some way by Islam. We can see this here. So I would just draw your attention. Can you see my pointer? Okay, good. Just draw your attention. Here we have some names: Ardo, Nogo, Varahi. Varahi is a Sanskrit rendering of Abraham, which means the swineherd. I mentioned that in the last talk. So these are kind of chronologically homonyms, I should say homophones. It seems that the names used for Muslim figures in this tantra and Muslim ideas in this tantra are being adapted into Sanskrit. They're not being simply, okay, here's Muhammad. Instead, here we have Madhumati. Right, I'll get to that in just a second. But this is, for lack of a better word, this is a little dark. So we've got Adam, Enoch, sometimes it's identified with Noah and Abraham, and these are described as being part of the Kula, or the family of Danu Bujagas, the demonic snakes in darkness, in Tamas. So there's those three, and then there's five other figures. Musa, cognate with the Arabic word for Moses, is of course Musa. Aisha is the most common rendering of Jesus in Hindi, Urdu, Arabic, and so forth. This kind of interesting figure, the white-clad one. And then we have Muhammad, whose name is Madhumati, and Matani, the destroyer. And he's described as being Andhika, which can mean from darkness, from the land of darkness. This is how some of the commentaries gloss it. It could also mean that he's blind, which matters for our story. So the seventh of the eight, Muhammad, or Madhumati, will clearly be born in the city of Baghdad in the land of Mecca, where the mighty, merciless idol of the barbarians and the Dharmanic incarnation live in the world. So, however we want to talk about the composition of this text, let's just talk about it being authored for the sake of ease right now. Whatever kinds of people authored this were concerned about Islam. They knew something about Islam, but not all that much. They knew Baghdad was a place, they knew Mecca was a place, but they didn't quite get it right. So this comes after a description of the land of Shambhala and the kings of Shambhala, and proceeds in, again, what I'm calling an apocalyptic narrative, in which the forces of Shambhala, led by the last king of Shambhala, Rudra Kalkin, will fight these, quote, demonic foes. And in particular, Rudra Kalkin will smite or kill in battle the Mitanni or Muhammad. Usually it's given as Mitanni, I believe. So I'll say more about the names in a moment, just to get the story across. Sorry for all of this, overloading these slides with text. I don't mean to just read everything out. I just want to highlight a couple of things. So you'll notice this is a few verses later, from when we jump from 154 to 163. So these ferocious warriors called mleccha, barbarian, or Tayan, which probably means roughly Tazik. These warriors will fight with elephants, and mountain horses shall smite the horses of Sind. It's an interesting kind of geographical point there. Mountain horses, I think, most refer to Central Asian horses, which are generally considered to be superior, particularly for warfare. So people will fight people and so forth, and Rudrakalki will smite Kurnmati, or the Mitanni, whose name in Sanskrit means the destroyer. And then, after the battle, there will be a new era of peace, justice, harmony, and happiness. All of the families shall be fulfilled with dharma, grain shall grow, trees will bear fruit. Right? If you're familiar with any apocalyptic literature, this should seem kind of immediately recognizable. A battle between the forces of good and evil. Good wins the day, and there's kind of an ushering in of a new era. That is a misconception about apocalyptic literature, that it's somehow the end of the world. It's not, right? It's just ushering in some kind of new, usually some better phase of existence. So we have this pretty straightforward, violent tale. And then we have, in the second chapter of the Kālacakratantra, so the first chapter of the Kalachakra is called The Outer, dealing with the world, geography, astrology, and so forth. Astronomy, I should say. The second chapter is the Inner Kālacakratantra, dealing with the channels, winds, and drops of the body, the basically subtle physiology, particularly of a human practitioner, and its relations to the movement of the planets, and so forth. So here, at a kind of inner perspective, the Kalachakra tells us that the war with the barbarian lord definitely occurs within the body. The illusory external war with the barbarians in the land of Mecca is certainly not a war. Okay, a lot of details for something that's not actually a war, right? How can we understand this? Well, again, if you're familiar with, some of the Islamic doctrine, this may remind you of the ambiguity of jihad, right? Which is often, of course, interpreted as a physical resistance, struggle, violence against real or perceived threats to Muslims and to Islam. But there is a concept of an inner jihad in which one basically is making war on one's negative emotions, to use kind of Buddhist terminology. I mentioned in the last talk, this also, I think, evokes Shantideva in his Bodhicharyavatara when he speaks about standing at the edge of a cave with a spear in order to kind of smite negative emotions before they can cause any harm. Right. Okay, so the first part of my talk is going to kind of go through what is going on here and how do we live in a world where this even happened, where this kind of material would show up in specifically in a Buddhist tantra. After that, hopefully with some time, I want to give a couple of examples of other ways that Muslims and Buddhists seem to have been speaking to each other. But we'll kind of see how far we get. So, as I mentioned, Abraham's name here, Varahi, the swineherd. That's a translation of Abraham, where Musa is the Arabic for Moses, as is Aisha the Arabic for Jesus. So we can kind of see where they're getting these things from. I just want to note the white-clad one has sometimes been interpreted as a reference to a Manichaean figure. I rely mainly for this material on John Newman's scholarship, and he's quite adamant that that's just not the case. He kindly gave me some time recently and confirmed what I believe is happening, which is that the white-clad one refers to specifically some Isma'ili figure. So within Shia Islam, right, we're dealing with the Seveners or the Ismailis specifically. You'll notice there's a set of 8 here, which is interesting. We call Ismailis Seveners because they believe in 6 human prophets, or 6 human imams, and then one imam who is sort of occluded. He's in darkness. The Arabic word is keba. So he's kind of not physically present in the world now, but he will come back. And when he comes back, Jesus will also come back. There will be a battle between good and evil. There's lots of other details, but what we have is more or less the same kind of apocalyptic narrative. I don't want to stress too heavily, oh, this is exactly the same story. It's not, but there's just too many coincidences here. So the white-clad one possibly refers to a specific Ismaili figure named Abu Muslim. I take it to just mean more generally Ismaili, some Ismaili figure. And then we've got Madhumati for Muhammad. Sounds similar, right? But Madhumat, depending on how you gloss mati, probably it means the one who is endowed with honey, which is how the Tibetan translations take it. Maybe the honey-minded one. I have found references to Madhumat or Madhumati that could mean the drunkard, or possibly like the slick one. Maybe I'm kind of overreading the sense of honey here, but it's my own speculation, but there is kind of language about Muslim traders being kind of sweet talkers, and I see some of that here personally, but that could very well be my own idea. And then the Matani, the destroyer, the Jomchepa in Tibetan, that pretty clearly refers to a uniquely Shia figure called the Mahdi, the guide. So the Mahdi is this hidden figure who's going to come back and fight alongside Jesus against the forces of evil, against the Antichrist, who in Arabic is called the Dajjal. I mention that partly because the Dajjal is blind. He's either obscured, he's very ugly, which is interesting. But so there's just a lot of resonances here, specifically with Ismaili apocalyptic literature. Okay. All right. So before we get to the history of how that could have happened, I want to say just a couple of other small things about discussions of Islam and Muslims in the Kālacakratantra. And Kālacakratantra here refers not just to the root text, but also to some commentarial literature as well. As I mentioned, the Kālacakratantra, particularly the first chapter, is an encyclopedia. You can learn how to build giant crossbows that can pierce elephant armor. You can learn how to build a carousel. It's in there. You can learn a lot about medicine and astrology. Basically, everything a Bodhisattva king should know. Was kind of an interesting question of the provenance of this encyclopedic literature, writing down manuals. Like in Jewish literature, we call them mirrors for princes. What is a ruler supposed to know? Most famous instance of that kind of literature, I would note, in available in English, is Machiavelli's book, The Prince. Similar kind of idea, right? Okay, but amongst other things, the Kalachakra gives what John Newman calls ethnographies of Muslims, not just Muslims, but some. So, excuse my cadence, I'm trying not to cough. The most negative statements in the Kalachakra, apart, of course, from the apocalyptic battle and the demonic snakes and so forth, concerns dietary practices. Particularly, the Kalachakra is really against eating beef and slaughtering animals for meat. In general, the Kalachakra is a pretty pro-vegetarian book, but that's a kind of separate question. Interestingly, when it describes Muslims eating beef, it describes them as boiling that beef in blood and mixing it with vegetables and butter. Now, boiling things in butter and mixing with herbs and vegetables is very common, not just in Indian cooking from around 1000, but also medical practices. That's how you prepare a lot of medicinal substances. But the idea of boiling beef in blood, I think, is kind of uniquely aimed at a Hindu or an audience that has kind of some sort of what we might call conservative Hindu kind of ideas, right? It's also thoroughly not something Muslims actually do. It's specifically forbidden in the Quran to use blood in that particular kind of way, right? If you know how halal meat is prepared, you know the first thing that happens, you get rid of all the blood. So maybe they knew. Maybe this was an intentional kind of thing to scare certain people. Maybe it's simply a misunderstanding. We don't know. It also describes or suggests indirectly that marriage practices among these groups can commonly involve incest, which I don't know. Maybe that's just another barb. I really don't know what's going on there. But it does call these mleccha-s or tie-ins. It says they're hygienic. They respect each other's property. They're skilled warriors, and they don't accept the caste system. Another kind of interesting ethnographic tidbit here that the authors here found this important, right? So, Hayan is a really interesting name for these people because, as you might know if you studied your Dharmakirti, Tayan is a common epithet of the Buddha as the protector. Right, he's given in the Mangala Shloka of the Dignagas Pramana Samuchaya, right? For example, he's the protector or the guide. It probably renders it's rendered into Tibetan, I should say, as Tajik, which can mean kind of Central Asian in general. Newman argues that this is not actually from the kind of laudatory epithet for the Buddha, but rather, he suggested may derive from a particular subset of outcasts, particularly no caste or outcast women from the southwest of the Deccan Peninsula. I'm not really in a position to weigh in on that, but Later Tayan generally seems to refer to Arabic, Persian, and Turkish or Turkic people. Oh, there's a typo there. Okay. The Kalachakra says that this group worships a god named Ar-Rahman, which is a very, very common name for Allah, right? The benefactor. And when they sacrifice animals, they call out the mantra Vishivimla, which Newman translates as withered by poison, but which pretty cognate with Bismillah, which is what a Muslim would say before slaughtering, halal meat, right? So here again, we've got a lot of suggestions of, some incomplete knowledge. My sense is that the authors of the Kalachakra were aware of Muslims and Muslim practices, but not because they were talking to people about the doctrines. They just kind of saw or heard something about it, right? I think a Muslim would be very quick to say, no, we don't boil our beef in blood. And this is what Bismillah means and so forth, right? So, that doesn't mean that Muslims and Buddhists weren't talking to each other. It just means that in this particular case, there wasn't seemingly not like a sustained doctrinal conversation, right? Let's see. Okay. So here again, why would this even be a thing in the world? Well, we've got some historical precedents. I spoke a fair bit about this in my last talk, so I'm not going to say too much about it. You can hear more if you want to look at that recording. Historical precedents, I mentioned here, I'm highlighting here Baul in what's now Afghanistan. Very, very important city for intellectual conversations between Buddhist and Muslim communities. I also just want to give us a lay of the land here a little bit, right? So Balkh was an important city for Buddhists through the 800s, and it was gradually came under Muslim cultural influence. In particular, there was a very large monastic university in Balkh called the Nāth that was overseen by a group of people called the Barmakids, who converted to Islam sometime in the late 700s and became viziers, ministers under the Abbasid court, particularly the court of Harun al-Rashid, who was made famous from the story of the 1001 Nights, that we know more generally as the Arabian Nights, right? One of the main points in my last talk was to note that the Navbahar at Balkh informed the philosophical content, the architectural structure, and the style of argumentation that became popular in Islamic madrasas, which started around that area, around the late 800s, and spread across the Muslim world. Following a scholar named Christopher Beckwith, I argue, and I think it's true, that Buddhist monastic universities directly influenced madrasas, and madrasas definitely influenced the evolution of European colleges and universities. So this is a kind of interesting, I think the place is worth highlighting in the idea because there is a very direct tie to, everything that we're doing at RYI, kind of through the split traditions of the indigenous Buddhist traditions and also this kind of workaround, right, through European universities. Okay, so that is, sorry, I'll go up one more second. So, when we talk about, Buddhist influence, we need to not limit ourselves to India or Nepal, right, and so forth. It is worth knowing that there's a lot of Buddhist influence in Afghanistan. I believe next week's speaker is going to talk a fair bit about that, right? So I'll let him do that. So if we take seriously the idea that the Kālacakratantra is dealing specifically with Isma'ili Muslim communities somehow, at least for its descriptions, the two most prevalent, most important Isma'ili political entities in this area at this time were a small emirate over here called Multan. So you can see that's very much within the grounds of Sindh, of India, Pakistan, and this pink empire over here, the Fatimid Caliphate, which is an Ismaili caliphate that was in kind of open hostility with the Baghdad Caliphate, right, which is Sunni. So Fatimids are Ismaili Shias, but then in Baghdad, there's the overwhelming provenance is Sunni. Okay, so the most obvious reason the Kalachakra would display some anxiety about Muslim violent people coming and invading and need for war is because something like that kind of did happen, right? Specifically, from the city of Ghazni, uh, which I believe is in Afghanistan today. Don't quote me on that, but I think so. Uh, a ruler named Mahmud, as you can see, started a series of campaigns in the late 900s, eventually moving into the Deccan Peninsula. Right now, Mahmud of Ghazni was kind of mixed Persian and Turkish kind of cultural descent, but he's very much in his raiding practices resembles, he's coming from a Turkish background, which is different from Persian and from Arabic, right? There had been centuries of, decent trading partnerships between Arabs and first Buddhists and later Hindu merchants, right? Persians, likewise, I've sort of always been on the border there, but the Turkic influence, I should say, is represented in a focus on horses, a focus on acquiring wealth and slaves to create more wealth. There's an obsession in literature around Mahmud of acquiring elephants. So we've got Central Asian horses, we've got elephants, right? And we've got raiding parties. So based on Ramila Thapar, the great historian of India, based on her work, I argue that Mahmud was not interested in actually settling India. He was interested in acquiring a capital so that he could build this really wonderful cosmopolitan city out of his capital, Ghazni. I say that because sometimes Mahmud of Ghazni is cast in Indian history as the sort of first instance of what became Muslim rule in the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals and so forth. Right. But okay, so the Kalachakra appeared in the world around 1026, 1030. It seems to have appeared in northeastern India. The timing sure looks good for an anxiety about specifically these raids, right? The most infamous of these raids, I should note, has little, if anything, to do with Buddhism. It's the destruction of a temple called Somanath. As far as I understand it, every school child who gets an education in India knows the name of Mahmud of Ghazni because he's kind of singularly associated. He's the face of a kind of certain idea of violent Islam. So he's got is very politically charged. Ramila Thapar wrote a book just about Somanath, trying to unpack, the different identities that Mahmud has in different times and places. I recommend that to you. But needless to say, this is a person, this is an army that's cast as violently opposed to anyone and anything that isn't Muslim. It's not totally historically accurate, but that's how it's cast. There seems to have been enough truth to it that the Kalachakra is taking this seriously in some way. John Newman points out, as does Sheldon Pollock, that apart from the Kalachakra, there's not a lot of literature in Sanskrit about Muslim invaders. Generally, Pollock argues that invading people from the Northeast aren't cast as, evil Muslims, right? That's sort of a narrative when Wendy Doniger talks about awful things the evil Muslims did. She's with characteristic humor and scholarship. In any case, the Kalachakra is very clear, but it's also kind of unique in this. there's no smoking gun. I can't unravel the mystery of exactly where or how the Kalachakra arose. I can only point these things out, right? It was only later on, about 200 years later, that the Delhi Sultanate was established. Here's what it looks like in 1236. This is when really Muslim political entities start to assert real dominance and real control in, South Asia broadly. So we're at time a little bit before that. So I want to say a little bit more about Mahmud, because it seems like the mythology of this figure probably informed the narrative in the Kalachakra, right? We don't know how much of it is based on actual violence. We don't know if it's just based on stories, but there's a lot of resonance here. So Mahmud of Ghazni styled himself a Ghazi, a holy warrior, someone who engages in jihad. He was very it was very important to him that the rulers in Baghdad knew that he was engaging in warfare on behalf of Sunnis, and that he was doing so as a kind of holy warrior. It's partly to curry favor with Baghdad in his kind of his quest for political power and political ascendancy and the creation of this excellent city in Ghazni. It's hard to argue against the idea that Mahmud did have a sort of specific hostilities with Ismailis and with non-Muslims. The sacking of Somanat is, etched into Indian history, historical self-understanding, partly because it does seem to have been a pretty violent, nasty, destructive raid. And there were others, of course. Along the way, Mahmud conquered the Ismaili kingdom of Multan, thus kind of bringing that back into a Sunni fold, right? However, he employed Hindu soldiers as mercenaries. Nothing particularly strange about that. But he also had full-time officers. So there would be Hindu regiments in his armies, and they would, be led. They would have as their commanders Hindu officers, who then reported to higher-ranking Sunni Muslim officers. There was also a specific quarter, an area of the city of Ghazni for these kind of Ghaznavid Hindus. I mention that because these two are at pretty significant odds, right? Now, as I said, Mahmud probably did think of himself as a holy warrior, but that didn't mean that he was just going to go out and kill everybody who wasn't Sunni, who wasn't Muslim. It's important to say because his secretary said specifically that he would go around and force everyone to convert or he'd kill everyone. There's probably some truth to that in some places, but it's more an idea that's important. The great historian Al-Biruni, who wrote a sort of geographical ethnography of India, who is part of Mahmud's court, does corroborate that. At the same time, his court poet, Al-Firdausi, forgive me if I'm not saying that correctly, wrote panegyrics, wrote poems bragging about how Mahmud would play on other people's religious fervor and use Hindus when he was attacking Ismaili sites or Shia sites. There's not a lot of discussion of him attacking Sunnis. I think he didn't want to do that because he didn't want to get out of favor with Baghdad. And he would use Muslims against Hindus. Right. So what we have here is another kind of slightly jumbled, slightly not adding up, right? Kind of narrative that seems to have been prevalent, at least in parts, around the time that the Kalachakra arose in the world. Okay. Just to remind us, as I mentioned, Arab traders have been doing business in Sind and in the Silk Road really since before the time of the Prophet, because the Prophet was a perfume merchant through his first wife Khadijah. He probably knew the word Tibet because he dealt in musk, and everybody knows that Tibet is where the best musk comes from. It's superior to Chinese or other kinds of musk. Um, that kind of language seems to have already been in kind of in vogue in Arabic at the time of the Prophet. There were Ismailis in India from at least the 9th or the 10th centuries. It's a little difficult. Let's make an aside here. I didn't prepare anything concrete to speak about in terms of Ismaili and Tantra, though they did adapt some forms of Tantra, particularly Tantric initiation practices. I think that's fair to say. But Ismailis were persecuted in a lot of different places and times. And there's a doctrine through which Ismailis are allowed to disguise themselves as Sunnis or Sufis or even Hindus or Buddhists or non-Muslims, if it meant kind of freedom from persecution. That's one avenue if you're interested in kind of how conversations happen between Hindu and Buddhist tantric practitioners, particularly yogic practitioners, and different kinds of Muslims. That's something that you'd really want to look at. There's a wonderful scholar named Dominique Silicon who really focuses on that specifically. She has lots of stories of Ismailis kind of masquerading as Hindu yogis, for example. And of course, there's going to be some kind of borrowing interaction there. It's kind of a particular point of intervention. Okay. As I mentioned in my last talk, the king of Kabul. Kabul was under Tibetan imperial control at the time. The king of Kabul converts from Himalayan Buddhism to Islam. And there's a story that he sent a silver statue of Amitabha to Mecca, where it was melted down and used to make coins, interestingly. Buddhists were definitely living in Gandhara until at least the 9th to 10th century CE, I think longer than that, as evidenced by the continuation of the Navbahar in Balkh, for example. Likewise, during the time of Harun al-Rashid, there were Indian astrologers in Baghdad. There's plenty of Sanskrit literature available in Baghdad. That seems quite clear. And particularly under the reign of this Caliph Harun al-Rashid, right? And having to do specifically with this family I mentioned before, the Barmakids. For purely palace intrigue reasons, the Barmakids fell out of favor when one of them slept with Harun al-Rashid's sister. And that marked not only the end of that dynasty, but really the end of a kind of Sanskrit-facing intellectual culture in Baghdad. After that is when we start to really see an emphasis on Aristotle and the Greek traditions and so forth. So apologies for going over that again. I think it's important. So what we have here is a rather strange, jumbled historical tale of people who were afraid, seemingly rightly, of invasions from Turkic, primarily Sunni Muslims. But the only frame the authors of the Kālacakratantra seem to have had for them is an Isma'ili one, right? So that speaks to kind of the piecemeal way in which understanding of Muslims seems to have arisen, right? I think there's good reason to believe that Multan was a source for some of these mutual understandings between Buddhists living in Afghanistan, for example, and those Ismailis, right? All of this makes sense. It's just interesting that the Turkic invaders that the Kālacakratantra is afraid of were seemingly just as interested in targeting Ismailis as targeting Buddhists and Hindus. Okay, I'm going to pause there. How are we doing on time? Sorry, I don't want to unshare my screen. Yeah, do that. Okay, so let me go briefly to the conclusion here. So that's sort of episode one of this talk. And we're going to have that in our minds, but then we're going to move to a slightly different set of conversations that also are dealing with kind of relationships between Buddhists and Sufis, Ismailis, and so forth. Okay, so let me go to the end here. So if we vault ourselves forward several centuries, we find this figure, Muhammad Muhyi al-Din, apologies for my pronunciation, in 1748, roughly, talking about yogic practices, especially yogic breathing practices. This is the practice of yogis. It is not the activity of the community of Muhammad. Nevertheless, it is correct. Now, if you know anything about Islamic doctrine, that is an absolutely astounding thing to hear someone say. There is extreme importance given on the idea of Islamic, Arabic, if not, then Jewish or Christian kind of influences as the sort of fountain and foundation for all things Islamic, right? So this is a pretty heavy counterexample. At least it looks that way to us. We'll kind of nuance that a little bit. So how could this be the case? Elsewhere, you see some Sufi masters saying, breathing practices, asana practices have to have come from Allah because they work. And if they didn't work, then they, in order for them to work, they have to be from, fundamentally Islamic in their orientation, basically, right? Patrick Rinpoche tells a story that once a Muslim told him that the Buddha became enlightened by reciting the name of Allah as a mantra. Who knows? But there is a kind of practicality in play in this next kind of set of conversations. And I mentioned here Aurangzeb, who, if you know your Indian history, is one of the most violent kind of anti-non-Muslim rulers in the Mughal Empire. But he consulted a Hindu yogi who would give him mercury pills to extend his life and prevent diseases and so forth. So there is just a basic practicality here, right? So it's difficult to state direct influence or directionality, partly because of historical ambiguities. As I said, we don't really know why there's a specific Isma'ili flavor in the Kālacakratantra. We don't really know the details of a lot of these things, but also because different people with different agendas have wanted to show either that this or that practice is not authentically Muslim, that it didn't derive from Arabic, or they want to show that it did, that it does, or that at least it's consistent, right? And so we really, as with all histories, we have to not look for historical facts, but look at the kind of creation of various kinds of narratives, right? Okay, but there's enough evidence to show that just as Muslims borrowed stories and medical knowledge from Sanskrit sources and Sanskrit-speaking people, and vice versa. Oh, I have some more. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, there's the time. Okay. Ooh.
No, this is not working.
Oh.
That's
Oh. Okay.
Confluences.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Cool. I'll try to keep it to 6. That worked. So there's certainly cultural sharing that shouldn't surprise us, right? That sharing exhibits what I'm calling a structural or a practical form. So as we'll see, there are Sufis who use identifiably Hindu yogic asanas and ideas that are also shared with Buddhist tantric yogis as part of kind of the broader Nāth siddha schema, right? Likewise, stories, mathematics, and so forth. I bring up this Barlam story here because I think it serves as a good kind of parallel example. As I mentioned in my last talk, the story of the Bodhisattva as a prince who leaves his kingdom and practices asceticism and kind of comes back as an ascetic to teach and impart wisdom, including to his family and so forth. That's a pretty general story, but that basic frame story, unmistakable in its details, becomes translated into Persian as the story of Bilawar wa Buddhisaf, and then into Arabic as Yudhisaf. So the Bodhisattva becomes made into a Persian prince, then an Arabic prince. Eventually, he becomes an Ethiopic prince and a Greek prince and a Spanish prince, where he gets into the Christian kind of pantheon of saints as Saint Jehoshaphat or Jehoshaphat, right? So the important thing there, the reason I mention it again, is there's nothing obviously Buddhist in the story of Jehoshaphat by the time it gets to the version attributed to John of Damascus that was popular at Mount Athos, for example. But the frame is used, and it's filled in with Muslim or Christian or Jewish doctrinal structures. So it provides a basis, but then the doctrine gets filled in. That seems like it should be kind of obvious, but it's worth highlighting because time and again we see how that happens. Just as we see this story being used for kind of Islamic theological agendas and so forth, we see what is unmistakably some Hindu, some yogic breathing practices, or Indic yogic breathing practices, but they become thoroughly kind of Islamicized, right? So I'll give more details when I give the examples, but I just kind of wanted to set that up as a frame. Okay. Right. Very quickly, Sufism is one of the things I'm going to touch on here. Etymology is from either suf, as in wool, referring to the rough wool that ascetics would wear, or saf, purity. Broadly speaking, the mystical aspect of Sunnism. Trimmingham, in his study of Sufi saints, gives an overly broad definition and says anybody who's a Sunni who seeks a kind of direct experience of God could be called a Sufi. Maybe that works, maybe not. But as of the 18th century, it is competing with a particularly popular form of, quote, Orthodox Sunni Islam, Wahhabism, right? Karsa. So there is an emphasis on reliance on God and on asceticism. I'll say why that's important in just a moment. Likewise, lineage is absolutely vital. Having a teacher is vital. Realization depends on transmission and practice. There are, itinerant ascetic orders. It's hard to say, oh, well, this comes from that. People in lots of different places have thought, oh, I'll be an ascetic, and so I'll carry around a bowl, and I'll wear kind of rough wool clothing, right? We don't have to say that definitely came from Buddhist monks, right? More evidence to think that mullahs really are a source, if not the source, for rosaries. But that's kind of a different question. So in the time that's left, just quickly, I'm going to give you a couple specific examples. Specifically, a couple of Sufi saints who seem to have been talking to Buddhists, who at least were kind of having conversations that were understandable to Buddhists, right? We don't want to go too far and say, oh, they took this from Buddhists, right? So there's a story of Shakik al-Balkhi, a very early Sufi saint. Balkh, this city in Afghanistan, at a time when there were still definitely Buddhists, when the Bahar was still a Buddhist university, right? Keep that in mind. He was a trader And he was challenged by a group of, the texts don't say Buddhist monks, but they do say shaven-headed ascetics. So people, reasonable speculation that they're Buddhists, that he should demonstrate his trust in God as the sole provider of men by abandoning his trade, that he should become an ascetic. And he's part of an influential kind of brand of Sufism associated with the city of Khorasan, sometimes called Eastern Sufism, which does really highlight, well, Sufis, if you're really focused on union with the divine, if you're really focused on religious practice, you shouldn't focus on being a trader. You shouldn't have a vocational, an occupation. There's kind of a tension in Islam about that, about whether it's your religious duty to work. Sometimes in places that's definitely true. You shouldn't just kind of go off and live, and beg. In other cases here, we see an emphasis on asceticism. At the very least, there's some resonance here. Likewise, Shakik al-Balkhi's teacher, Ibrahim ibn Adham, has a life story that sounds a lot like Shakyamuni's life story. He was a non-Muslim prince. He converted and pursued rigorous ascetic practices, and then became a teacher of this kind of renunciate movement, right? And then here, this is just the etymology: Bodhisattva, Buddhasaf, Yudasaf, Yosaf, Josephat. A slightly later figure, Bayazim al-Bastami, said to have been a student of Shakik al-Balkhi. The dates maybe work. If it's true, then Shakik was very old and Bastami was very young. I'm not sure if we know when he was born, so it's hard to say. But he was a proponent of what's called intoxicated as opposed to sober Sufism, which is associated again with these renunciate kind of orders of Sufism associated with Khorasan and with the eastern edges of the Islamic world. He learned from an obscure figure named Al-Sindi. So we've got al-Balkhi, now we have Al-Sindi, so also someone presumably from a kind of Hindu, Buddhist, religious kind of heartland at the very least. So this intoxicated Sufism deals with self-annihilation in the contemplation of divine unity, such that there's no difference between the practitioner's nature and Allah. I'll explain that in a second and give you a contrast. He's also associated with what's for us a very interesting idea, the malamatya, the path of blame, which does seem like it has resonances with Vamacharya or left-handed practices. This is fairly early for any kind of real mature kind of tantric influence, but it's definitely possible historically speaking. So the Sufi path of blame, on the one hand, is a focus on inner practice, not kind of going around like displaying oneself as pious, as some great ascetic figure, but really just keeping it all inside. And on its extreme end, actually, actively shunning those things and inviting blame. So one example that's said about Bastami is that he would take an alcohol bottle and empty it out. So he wasn't really drinking alcohol, but he would fill it with water, and he would go around in the street acting drunk. So that he would kind of cultivate blame as a way to annihilate his ego. If you're familiar with Mahasiddhist stories, maybe, that reminds you of some things, going to a wedding and getting beaten up, stuff like that, right? At the very least, there's these resonances. I should note that while there's similarities with Vajrayana practices, there's also similarities with the kind of forerunners of what become tantric practices. So the Pashupatas and the Kapalakas would also do this sort of thing. They would kind of like the Pashupatas theory of karma is that if someone beats you up and you don't deserve it, then your bad karma kind of transfers out of you and is taken on by the aggressor. That's a very, very ham-handed way of saying it. But roughly speaking, there are these other ideas about the transference of karma and the method of liberation that can involve this kind of behavior. Let's see, the Qalandars I'm not going to talk too much about, but they're definitely a very interesting group. They look like Nāth siddhas. Some of them have the rings in their ears, typical of Nāth siddhas, and so forth. None of this should really be surprising, but it is surprising partly because Islamic studies and Buddhist studies just don't talk enough, right? That's kind of a side note. So, in brief, there's evidence that Sufis in Khorasan, such as Shakik, Bistami, and later on, an important Sufi saint, Farid ad-Din Attar, interacted with yogis, alchemists, scholars of Ayurveda. There was some sort of conversation going on here. It's just, again, hard to know whether things are just looking similar or if there's actual influence. So Bistami, I won't read this whole quote for time. Bistami makes sort of radical claims. There is neither I nor other than I. There is no God but I. He was criticized in his time by basically claiming to be God. It's not really what he was doing. He was talking about this kind of mystical union, right? But it's easy to see how a conservative, Sunni thinker might have a problem with that. So Bistami's kind of intoxicated Sufism contrasts with the so-called sober Sufism popular in Baghdad, associated with this figure Junaid, who's a little bit later. So he has a slightly different idea. Know that you are veiled from yourself by yourself. You will not attain him through yourself. You will attain him only through him. So that's not a union. There's still this annihilation of the ego kind of going on, but the actual technologies are very, very different. And it's certainly interesting. And I think it's probably not a coincidence that the trend of Sufism that has these kind of left-handed practices is also the one that speaks about realization in a way of kind of always already terms, and those are not present in Baghdad Junaid sober Sufism. Okay, so last point, I wanted to mention a scholar of Islamic studies named Carl Ernst, and I think he's at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that are Duke. He tried hard. He spent years trying to find evidence of yogic practices among Sufis. And he does a lot of work generally on Sufism and yoga and kind of how to responsibly navigate this sort of difficult area. So I'd recommend his work theoretically. But he did find this one text, the name reconstructed as the Amrita Kunda, the pool of nectar, the pool of Amrita, translated as pool of the water of life into Arabic. Ernst found something like 40 copies from the 1600s across the Arabic-speaking world. So this is not a sort of a obscure, completely obscure, unknown text. It seems like it was actually used by a fair number of Sufis. Emphasizes yogic practice. In particular, it has very detailed instructions on how to perform a vase breathing or kumbhaka breathing, bumchen, in Tibetan. Gives measurements using fingers, finger lengths, which we also see in Buddhist tantric texts, right? Also, some identifiable asanas, yogic postures. And Ernst identifies what he thinks is Khechri mudra and Vajravali mudra, which are, in my opinion, kind of specifically tantric. Maybe someone would argue with me there, but Khechri mudra roughly is a practice of kind of focusing, drawing energy, including kind of physical, gross bodily energy, into the cranium and perhaps out, right? Khechri mudra. That's associations with Vajrayogini, Vajrayogini's paradise of Ketra, pretty obvious. Vajravali mudra is sometimes translated as urethral suction. It's a specifically sexual tantric practice involving the retention of vital fluids. So these are unambiguous, I think, and it's pretty clear that this seems to have some kind of foundation in Sanskritic yogic technology. Right, and I note here, the great historian Al-Biruni did translate the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. but focus on philosophy. So this is a unique text in that it's talking about practicing, doing yogic practices that are identifiably derived from Hindu texts and tantric traditions. Right. But the text does not treat yogis as separate from Islam. Eventually, they become described as a subset of Sufis. And likewise, over time, especially, different versions of the text, you see more and more omission of obviously Sanskrit ideas. Sanskrit mantras get swapped out. Sanskrit terminology gets more and more kind of Islamicized, right? So instead of mantra recitation, the text talks about dhikr, which is a very important Sufi practice of recitation or repetition, right? It's a similar idea, but within a kind of doctrinally okay Islamic frame, right? Okay. Right, and then I wanted to note, so there's clear reason to think that some Sufis were adopting yogic breathing practices, particularly kumbhaka or vase breathing and asana, but people can jump a little bit too far too fast because there are a lot of visualizations, particularly visualizations of verses and letters and so forth, including kind of a Sufi practitioner might visualize different letters and like themselves in like a kind of visualized box, that's kind of guarded with letters, likewise inside of the body. But those are very different from what might seem at first glance like parallel practices. I think there's just too many differences, and there's too good of a case to be made that this is actually deriving from earlier Islamic sources. Right, so we have a case of something that does seem like borrowing, and a case of something that might look like borrowing, but probably isn't. Right. Okay. Right. I'll stop here. It's a shame we don't get to talk about the bowels. Really cool folks. But when we're talking about, tantric practices, broadly speaking, after a certain time period, they're affiliated with this group called the Nāth siddhas, right? Particularly their founders, Gorakh Nāth and Matsyendra Nāth, who developed, it seems like they're credited with developing these yogic breathing practices, such as vase breathing, but also Khetri and Vajravali Mudra practices, right? And so the Nāth siddhas, as the historian David White states, were amenable to syncretism. So there are a lot of Nāth siddhas, most obviously Gorakh Nāth and Matsyendra Nāth, who are called guru or Nāth, but then the Sufi word pir is used in Islamic context, but it's pure Gorakh Nāth. So Gorakh Nāth's name does appear in Arabic Sufi texts. There are arguments that Gorakh Nāth is another name for the prophet, things like that. So you see some ambiguity, but then, as I've said, there is this kind of process of sterilizing, maybe, making hygienically Islamic, these things. So you tend to see mentions of Gorakh Nāth kind of gets replaced with mentions of Sufi saints and things like that after a certain time period. Let's see. And right, so he mentions the Bowls of Bengal, who sing very interestingly tantric songs. He specifically, David White notes that this is similar to Buddhist tantric songs, right? Coming from the heartland of the Hevajra Tantra, particularly. It's an interesting idea in itself. I would note also, there are Muslims who revere Gorakh Nāth. There are, of course, Hindus who revere Gorakh Nāth, but Gorakh Nāth is one of the Mahasiddhas as well. So it's a little disingenuous to even say that these are Hindu figures. They're more like maybe kind of a quasi non-sectarian figures that get adopted and claimed by different sects. We see this also, of course. Buddhists don't have a monopoly on Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is a very important Jain alchemist, for example. But it's the same Nagarjuna. That's sort of the general idea. Okay. Right. So, thank you. Not much in the way of, concrete conclusions, rather stories about stories and different ways of approaching how influence could work through, more as much as anything else, I wanted to, convey some of this interesting information and hopefully contribute to conversations. But methodologically, I hope that you're seeing kind of useful things here about how to navigate, well, what could be the case? How could it have happened? How did this appear in the world? Basically a mix of literary analysis and a certain kind of historical critical theorizing, right? So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that was enjoyable. Thank you very much.
So we can open for questions. All right. Any comments or questions from the room? If you are online, you could write your question. We will read it for you. Yes.
Hello, I'm Ratna Jyoti Sake.
Nice to meet you.
From Patan. I miss your lecture because I have an important call.
So,
by the way, what I am expecting to hear from you, it was beautiful whatever I heard from you today, Buddhism and Islam. I came from a prestigious caster's family, statue maker, and very related with Tsukini Rinpoche. I had joined with Edward 91. We studied together. Thomas was our teacher, translator. Umala Jupa, we studied middle way. This is how it is connected. And my father made Dorje Sempa right in the big hall downstairs. There are 3 statues. Guru Rinpoche on the right is Dorje Sempa. That was historical, older than me. I'm 67 years old, but it is 70 years. But what I am talking about just now.
Yeah.
So I am very much curious about the destruction of University in Nalanda.
mm-hmm. Right.
800 years ago, 12th century.
Right.
How it was destroyed. It is related very much with Indian destruction of Buddhism, philosophy, art, culture, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any, you have mentioned here?
Yeah, I can say something about it, sure. Right, so there's a theory that, along the lines of Wendy Doniger's, those awful things those evil Muslims did kind of thing, that Islam swept through northern India like a sword and killed everybody and destroyed everything. That I'm not trying to downplay the destruction, the murder. I'm not trying to do that, but that's sort of a fanciful thing. There's a nice article called "The Power of the Islamic Sword" in narrating the death of Indian Buddhism that I'd recommend. It's by Audrey Trusk. I think I'm saying her name correctly, but long story short, I follow Arthur McEwen's research, which argues that, okay, the library was burned. We don't know if it was partially kept. We don't really know. The story is that it was burned. But the monastery, it would be very difficult to destroy Nalanda. And basically, the way Arthur McEwen narrates it, in my understanding, is monastic communities remained in Nalanda for, I believe, a few hundred years. Because it still had the substructure. It still had a water system. It still had dormitories. It still had everything you need for a university. It was smaller, and over time it became smaller and smaller. But there was quite a lot of time where groups of monastics would simply leave when they thought they were in danger, and then come back. And so it remained an institution in some sense after the kind of the burning of Nalanda, and when was it, like 1290 or something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Very informative, very interesting. Was wondering about one thing, in relation, but also to any other scholarly deconstructions that in which we may engage for some scholarly purposes. And in particular, when we deal with such texts, which have living traditions still, like Kālacakratantra still practiced,
Mhm.
still commented on.
Mhm.
So then, first of all, do you know how tradition takes it? Like what you have taught us today, yeah? How do they comment on it, first of all? And second, what does it mean for the tradition and for the practicing tradition? When you find such evidence, as you have demonstrated today, for the human, that the text actually, for example, can be dated to some 11th century CE, etc. So then both can reconcile it and still preserve the authority of such text for the tradition.
Thanks. Great question. This is why I was speaking about authors just for our purposes today. In general, I try to avoid that. I think scholars have a duty to find language that doesn't do violence either to the academic tradition or the Buddhist traditions. And so that's why I say it appeared in the world. That's perfectly consistent with the Buddha taught it at, why am I blank on the name of that? Amaravati Stupa. Am I getting that right? While he was teaching the Heart Sutra. There's nothing inconsistent about that. I don't want to give like a non-answer. I mean, there's a lot in the Buddhist tantras that most people don't do these days, right? If we read the Shakrasamvara of another living tradition, there's lots of things that would probably get you arrested or thrown into an insane asylum, having to do with the acquisition of magical powers by going into cemeteries and things like that. I don't mean to kind of wash that away. But I think, we have to be honest with what the texts say and also, like acknowledge that it's a living tradition. But in this case, well, first off, we've got this idea of the kind of internal reading of the war, that it's not actually literally a war. It'd be interesting to see like what His Holiness Dalai Lama says about this when he gives the Kālacakratantra, because there is the idea that you're going to, if you get the Kalachakra, you're going to be reborn in Shambhala and you're going to participate in this war. So that'd be interesting to think about. But the outer and the inner Kālacakratantra describe the impure world, the way the world is. And then the other three chapters, right, are the alternative Kalachakra, which describe the transformation of the ordinary world into an sort of enlightened paradise, right? So I don't think it does. I don't think it would be kind of easily offensive to speak about like, well, there's wars in the world right now, and the Kalachakra gives a method for creating kind of an enlightened universe, right? Lastly, in terms of scholarship, John Newman's dissertation called The Outer Wheel of Time, I think is still the best resource for this. And he goes through these verses. He translates several commentaries, including K-Droop's Padmini commentary, and he includes a lot of discussion about what later authors had to say about these different things. So I would suggest that you look there for more details.
Possible. Thanks for giving me opportunity to ask a question. So my question is, so according to the Leven Igni Namthar, yeah. So there is a mention Ngonpa Dalin Sum. So the Ngonpa Dalin Sum. So do you think that all are by Muslim? So do you have to say anything on that?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the text that you're talking about. Anybody want to weigh in? Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure.
Madam, I think Madam Julie can translate. Our professor. Yeah, Love Indian Namthar. Yeah, biography, Love Indian biography. There is mention Ngonpa Dalin Sum is happening in Nalendra.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Vasubandhu lived, we think, several centuries before the Prophet was alive. So I don't know exactly what's going on with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's online. A request for mentioning the The article you talked about, maybe a little bit slower so people can take note. The article about Nalanda's long continuation, you mentioned an article there.
Okay, yeah, I mentioned, well, there's the article I mentioned is by Audrey Trusk. His name is a little difficult to spell, but it's called The Power of the Islamic Sword in Narrating the Death of Indian Buddhism. It's a pretty intense kind of title, but for actual information about Nalanda, that's more about kind of the rhetoric of these ideas. For actual information about Nalanda, I would recommend Arthur McEwen's dissertation. It's called, I think, From Bodh Gaya to Lhasa in Beijing, and he has a book called Guardian of a Dying Flame that's produced by it's part of the Harvard series. So that's where I would look as McEwen's Guardian of a Dying Flame. Yeah.
Great, thank
Excuse
you.
me, what is the spelling of the surname? What?
Oh, McEwen, sorry, yeah, it's MCK, yeah, EOWN. I sure can. One moment. Thank you.
W-N-O-W-N. Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
No.
Okay, sorry. 1 second. Okay, let me. Yes. Better? Okay. Good. All right. Hopefully that helps. And then here. Oh. Geez. Okay. Yeah. I'm just gonna write down the other person's name.
Yes, actually, chat.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
I think there's an H missing in Trushke.
This is the about the sort of the rhetoric. Okay, hang on. Let me. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Other.
So, yeah, another question. There are multiple Muslim scholars that have the theory that Buddha was also a prophet. But when we ask it to Buddhist scholars, they reject the idea and endorse by saying there is no such evidence, claim, or reference by the Buddha in any text teachings. Could you address this matter?
I mean, you could go a few ways with this. You could go the Jesus went to India kind of route, which might, I mean, there is a temple of Asia that has some similarities with Jesus. I can't really weigh in. I don't want to offend anybody. I can't really weigh in one way or the other on that. But here I would just this opportunity really more than anything else to bring up the fact that the Ahl Bayt or the Ahl Kitab, the people of the book in Islam, usually we think of Jews, Christians, and Muslims as sort of having the special status. For a while, when Buddhists and Muslims were trading together a lot, Buddhists were considered to be people of the book, and were in at least some communities given the sort of special freedoms that those people were afforded, right? As for the Buddha being a prophet, I mean, Saint Thomas may have gone to South India hundreds of years before the prophet was alive. I'm not sure. I don't want to. Yeah, I just don't know how it would work. That's all.
Right. So there's a surah in the Quran that talks about a prophet that sat underneath the fig tree. And so some people have interpreted that as being the Buddha, particularly the scholar Sayyid Nasar from George Washington University.
Yeah.
He wrote a very famous work on that. So, yeah.
Thanks. Well, do you remember Sayyid Hussein Nasr? Do you remember the name of the book?
Sayyid Nasar is I forget his full name, but he's a scholar from Washington, D.C. That's where I'm from. So he's a local, and the people I studied with when I was in graduate school in DC knew him very well. I saw him talk a few times, And he's a very, very interesting scholar that's very into Sufism and very into ecumenical kind of dialogue with other religions and things like that. He wrote some very, very interesting books, and he recently wrote something called the Study Quran with a professor of mine that I used to.
That, wow.
Yeah. Well, they co-wrote it.
Okay.
So they translated it and compiled a bunch of scholastic kind of texts associated with the Quran. But the article I'm talking about, I teach in my Islamic studies course. I can't remember the name of the article now, actually, but he talks about all these different confluences between, Eastern traditions and Western traditions, and he mentions that there's a surah in the Quran that says that there's a prophet that sat underneath the fig tree, and people in South Asia immediately recognize it as being the Buddha.
That's interesting. I mean, as I said, there's lots of informal ideas, like Patrick Rinpoche, as I said, met a Muslim who associated the Buddha with practices around Allah. I've never heard of any scholarship on the matter, so that's really cool. Thank you.
I guess we're coming to the end.
Okay.
We would like to thank you very much